looks like the microphone was muted this entire time. So that's certainly a fantastic thing. I'm new to this and looking into this, and certainly not having somebody else kind of do these things for me is a rather difficult thing. So we'll see what we can do about editing out the beginning portion there that has no audio to it whatsoever. But as we're discussing here, the subject matter is textual criticism, and we're specifically looking into the ideas of how King James Onlyism specifically interacts with textual criticism, and how we can begin to formulate responses to some of those things. Now, as a brief, specific introduction to textual criticism, whenever you look at the subject matter of textual criticism, you look at it from the perspective that we don't have the original manuscripts of the New Testament. And this is the case with many things. You're looking at Homer's Iliad, for example. We don't have the original Iliad that Homer wrote. And so because of that, we have to use what's known as textual criticism to specifically look at how it is that we can reconstruct or get to the original text. And in order to do that, you do the process of textual criticism. And certainly we've got a lot of people on here that have been saying that we were unable to hear me. So thank you guys for letting me know that. I think the audio should be fixed. So if that's not the case, please let me know again. But yeah, the process of textual criticism is specifically looking into the fact that we don't have the original manuscripts of the New Testament, and therefore we need to do the process of textual criticism to recover the original text. Now, when you do that, you basically take all available manuscript evidence at your disposal, and you look at the dating of each manuscript, you look at the amount of manuscripts that you have, and you formulate a conclusion of what the original text would be by examining that evidence. And so that's the process of textual criticism. There are different methods and methodologies, but it's generally agreed upon that that's how you do textual criticism. So you would look at the earliest manuscripts that you have available to you. And in looking at those manuscripts, you would understand that those early manuscripts have the least amount of copies between them and the original text. That's kind of a rather obvious statement, rather statement of fact, but that's certainly the case. And then, beyond that, you look at the amount of manuscript evidence that you have, and you understand that the more manuscripts that you have available to you, the greater the chance of having the entire original text available at your disposal. And so you look at both of those. Now, a King James Onlyist, like my friend, he's going to look at that and he's going to say that the latter method is the best method. You look at the majority of manuscripts, and that's how you understand what the best reading ultimately is. So in recognizing some of those things, he puts it forth as pitting those two concepts against each other when textual criticism itself is not necessarily doing that. And so as a King James Onlyist, his position would be that really whatever is in the King James Version is most likely to be the original reading. And we'll demonstrate that here in just a moment as we specifically go through a passage of Scripture that would answer the question, at least on this passage that we'll talk about, Revelation 16:5, that in that passage specifically, the King James Version is not the most accurate. Because the critical question to ask is, what did God originally say? What did he originally write? What did he originally speak? What did the authors of the New Testament originally write? And since we don't have the original writings, you really have to do the process of textual criticism. You really have to go through and examine all the available manuscripts at your disposal and figure out what the original reading is. But for a King James Onlyist, that's not necessarily the case. For them, in fact, really, they don't care about the manuscript tradition. They don't care about doing textual criticism. And so because of that, there's a disconnect between some of the statements that they'll make and what the actual case is. So a King James Onlyist, somebody who holds to the King James Version as being the best, or the only translation. And hopefully within this discussion, it might be helpful to some to recognize what the best translation for them would be. And I would suggest, as a matter of preference, that we would choose translations that we understand to be reliable. And one of the translations that I would recommend is the King James Version. I have here on my shelf a very exciting edition. This is a 400th anniversary King James Version, and it is a 400th anniversary of the 1611. It's a reprint of the 1611, and so very, very fantastic Bible. V's are U's in this Bible. I's are in place of J's, and so it's very difficult English, but it's a fantastic translation, and it's been updated numerous times. The King James Version has, and so I would recommend one of those as a viable and meaningful translation. And the English Standard Version, the New American Standard Bible, those are good translations to specifically focus on. The problem is not the King James Version, so don't misunderstand me as I'm interacting with King James onlyists. The problem is not the King James Version. The problem is specifically King James onlyism, where individuals make statements that there are no problems whatsoever in the King James Version. It's either the best translation, the best representation of the original text, or it's the only translation. And as my friend has communicated to me in numerous emails, it was used for 400 years. It was a 400-year text. It was used by God's providence in church history, and therefore, why change? If it was good enough for the Puritans, then it was good enough it's good enough for me today. Which the kind of argumentation that goes into King James onlyism in my mind is exactly like, if it was good enough for Jesus, then it's good enough for me, because of how staunch of an adherence to that being the best Bible that they have. And it's a very fascinating thing, and so we'll go through a lot of different things related to King James onlyism within this webcast and future webcasts to come. And so certainly we can dive right in to the scriptures, and we'll demonstrate some of the issues here, because again, this friend of mine, he had criticized me for specifically relying upon scholars and looking for individuals who are in the field of textual criticism and believing what they have to say, and he believes that he's Bible alone, he's Bible only. And I think there's a lot of people that have a misunderstanding with respect to sola scriptura. I think the way that they understand sola scriptura is solo scriptura. And really what that means is that their own interpretation ends up being the final authority. So you'll hear it oftentimes expressed in conversation with somebody, where if you even think about referencing a scholar or a commentator, you're just relying upon the opinions of men. You're focused upon a man-made opinion. And same is true with this individual with respect to textual criticism, is I'm relying upon scholars. But of course the fact of the matter is that we're not citing people who are idiots. Eldon J. Epp, Gordon Fee, Bruce Metzger, a lot of these guys are not dumb people. They're not individuals who sat around and thought, what's the best way that I can come up with ideas about textual criticism? Same with scholars who do commentaries. These are individuals with Christian education, of course not defending every single person who's ever written a commentary, whoever claimed to be a scholar in the field of textual criticism, not defending everybody. But the specific sources that I would use, that almost every Christian that I know would use in terms of commentaries, are individuals that are not idiots. They're not people who woke up one day and said, what can I make up about the scriptures? It's just not the case. And so if you disagree with what somebody presents from a scholar or a commentator or a pastor or some kind of a student of the word, then demonstrate it. Actually step up and do some work to show that what somebody is saying is false. Prove it. And you can prove it from the scriptures. You know, you can be a Berean. That's what the scriptures teach us to be, is to be a Berean. It's to examine things. It's to look at things and figure out what is specifically going on there. But don't just dismiss somebody as, well, that's somebody's opinion. That's your opinion. I mean, really, your opinion, that a scholar or a commentator's opinion is just their opinion, is your opinion. And so how have you done any kind of meaningful work to specifically prove that what somebody is saying is wrong? So when it comes to the field of textual criticism, this brother and anybody else who is a King James onlyist, they have to rely upon the scholarship that has come before them, men and women even, who have dedicated their lives to the study of textual criticism, looking at the manuscript evidence and understanding what is there. There's nothing wrong with looking at a textual critical scholar and understanding some facts that you had not put forth the work to do. But just to simply sit back and say that's nothing but scholar's opinion, I'm using my Bible, well, number one, that doesn't answer any of the questions to any of the specific issues. What is wrong with Revelation 16:5? If you have a King James Version with you right now, and you have a New American Standard Bible, for example, and you look at the differences in Revelation 16:5 amongst those versions, and I have a modern King James Version right here, saying, "And I heard the angel of the water say, Thou art righteous, O Lord, which art and wast and shalt be, because thou hast judged thus." And if I pull up an English Standard Version and look at Revelation 16:5, you'll notice that there's a specific difference that exists there. And the difference has to do with that phrase in the King James Version, which specifically says, "and shalt be," versus something like the ESV, "And I heard the angel in charge of the water say, Just are you, O Holy One, who is and who was, for you brought these judgments." And so as a King James onlyist, to say, let's throw out all the scholars, let's not use the scholars, let's use our Bibles, how do you explain the difference between the King James Version and Revelation 16:5? How do you say that is an explainable difference from the Bible only? How does the Bible give you the ability to determine what the correct reading is? Well, as a King James onlyist, what do you think the answer is going to be? It's in the King James Version, so therefore the King James Version is correct. So this individual and other King James onlyists, they have to rely upon scholarship. They have to rely upon people outside of the Scriptures, and it's not violating sola scriptura to do so. Because sola scriptura is essentially the understanding that the Bible is its own best interpreter. That's the real issue for the Reformers, and they saw it as the means of being able to refute even the Pope, was to focus upon the fact that the Bible, improperly interpreted within its context, being shown what the context is actually presenting, can actually refute the Pope. That's sola scriptura. That's using the Bible alone. But it's not using the Bible in isolation. There's still a biblical prescription for pastors to interpret and to present the Scriptures. People are able to understand the Scriptures and are able to present the Scriptures. That's the idea of sola scriptura. So King James onlyism, asserting that the King James Version is the best translation, and in many circumstances, for some individuals, the only translation, and that there are no problems in the King James Version. And so one thing that we can do is we can specifically look at the issue of Revelation 16:5 and try to come together on why it is that there is a specific difference and which version has the better reading. And if we figure out that a specific version has a better reading, then shouldn't the version that has the bad reading be updated? I think that's a valid question. If a version, if a translation can be demonstrated as having an incorrect translation, which could be based upon manuscript evidence, then shouldn't we update that translation? And in the case of the King James Version, it had been updated. It had been updated several times. There's a 1629 version, there's a 1638 version, there's a 1762 version, there's a 1769 version. There's a number of versions of the King James Version, and they were updated to fix particular issues. So why would we not do that continually? Now, I suppose, given some translations like the ERV, the English Revised Version, not to be confused with the RSV or the RSV, but the ERV as being an 1885 publication, if there's a publication that is specifically an old publication, you may not necessarily have to worry about updating that, but just simply be honest. Be honest about the issues that are present within a translation. At some point, I'm not too sure if we'll have time to do that today, but we'll go through the specifics of the NASB and the ESV and why I have preference over one reading versus another. So just simply being honest about the issues of a translation is the way to go. And there's no reason to vociferously defend a translation against attack, especially if you know that there are problems that are within it. So I have Revelation 16:5 queued up. Let me go ahead and switch to it. See if this works here. And so here on the right side of the screen, we have the Nestle-Aland 28th edition Greek New Testament, which again, the work of the textual critic is to examine the available manuscripts, and the proper way of doing it is to then formulate what you have as an eclectic text. In other words, you look at manuscript readings, and amongst the manuscript readings, you figure out what reading you think would be most original, and then you would footnote the rest of the readings in what's known as a critical apparatus. So you can see down at the bottom, on the bottom right-hand side, you see the Novum Testamentum Graeci, 28th edition critical apparatus. And so that lists all the known textual variants, and they put it in the footnote as a means of allowing the textual critic, the student of textual criticism, to begin to look at the manuscript evidence for themselves and begin to make determinations of their own. And so they say on the above line, the text that's above here on the upper right hand corner of the screen, that's the above line text, that's your eclectic text. And so the original text that was understood in textual criticism was either the text above the line or the text below the line. And so regardless, you can be sure that you have the original text, whether the editors thought that it belonged above the line in their reading, or they thought it was a textual variant that may not have been original, they still put it in there. They still were honest about the textual variants that exist there. So Revelation 16:5, the phrase in the King James Version that is translated "and shalt be," which in the ESV is translated "O Holy One," there's obviously a difference in translation because this is what's known as a textual variant. There's a place in the Greek manuscripts, the 5700 Greek manuscripts, where there is a different reading. Now, of course, dealing with the introduction to textual criticism, there are about 400,000, or maybe more now, there are about 400,000 textual variants in the New Testament. And as many textual scholars will point out, there's that many variants because there's that many manuscripts. When you examine the fact that we have 5,700 manuscripts, and you see then that we have textual variants within them, the fact that we have so many manuscripts is why we have so many textual variants. Now, 99% of all textual variants are spelling issues. So in other words, they have no meaning whatsoever, they have no impact, I should say, whatsoever on the meaning of a passage. Less than 1% have a viable impact on the meaning of a passage. And even then, if the less than 1% was still original, it hasn't changed Christian doctrine. If certain passages that seem very dubious, if they seem very doubtful as to being original, they don't change the meaning of Christian doctrine. They don't change Christian doctrine. They don't introduce new Christian doctrine. They don't take away Christian doctrine. So Christian doctrine and theology remains steadfast even in the midst of the variants. So this is one of the 400,000 textual variants is present right here in Revelation 16:5. Now I've highlighted more than just the specific variant, primarily because the phrase itself is in question for a lot of King James Onlyists. So the phrase is this highlighted portion up top. The highlighted portion below is the critical apparatus's explanation of the textual variants. So the phrase here is ha'ein ha'hasias. Ha'ein means the one who was, ha'hasias means the Holy One. Prior to that is ha'on, and ha'on is the one who is. Now, if you've ever read a Greek translation of Exodus 3:14, you know that the Greek translation is translating the Hebrew text for the I am as ha'on, the one who is, the existing one. So there's a lot of beauty in the fact that you see Greek terminology for the name of Jesus, for the name of God in the New Testament, and if you compare that to the Greek translation of the Old Testament's rendering of certain Hebrew names, certain Hebrew words that are titles or names for God, you start to begin to see a lot more of the deity of Jesus Christ opening up, as if it wasn't already established by even just reading an English translation. But just wanted to note that, wanted to point that out. Ha'on is the name of Yahweh in the Greek translation of the Old Testament in Exodus 3:14, the existing one. So it's Ha'on, the one who is, Kai, the Greek word, and Ha'ain, the one who was, and Ha-hasios, the Holy One. Hasios meaning holy. Now that whole phrase there is subject to textual variance down in verse 5. Now, what's fascinating is my King James only friend has pointed out that prior to the 10th century, there are 4 Greek New Testament manuscripts that have that are in existence at all on this verse, and that they read, all 4 of them read, Hasios, the Holy One. So prior to the 10th century, the reading has been the Holy One, which means that the earliest Christians reading Revelation 16:5 would not have read, and shalt be, of course they wouldn't have read any English, as they were not reading any English translation at all, but they would read the Holy One. They would read what we understand to be a phrase in the Greek text that means the Holy One. That's what they would have read. So they would not have read in the first 900 years of church history, they would not have read the same reading that is present within the King James Version, which I think is an important issue, because my King James only friend and many King James onlyists would be quick to point out that the King James Version was used providentially by God for 400 years. Well, what about the first 900 years of the church? Did they have the original reading? Did they have the Word of God in the first 900 years of the church? Did God providentially use the Alexandrian manuscripts, the manuscript text type that pre-existed the majority text type? That certainly the Byzantine text type existed as a text type prior to the 10th century, but it was not a majority text prior to the 10th century. Prior to the 10th century, the majority of manuscripts are Alexandrian manuscripts, which many King James onlyists are quick to point out that's Alexandria, Egypt, and that's nothing but heresy, and yet that's the text type of the early church. So did God providentially use that, or is what God providentially used no longer in existence? And if so, if God can providentially use something for 900 years, drop it, and then providentially use something else for 400 years, why couldn't he providentially use something else for the next 400 years and drop the King James Version? I mean, there's just so many questions that have to be asked that the King James onlyists really cannot answer, because they've somehow seen the secret counsel of God in His providence for 400 years as using the King James Version. Of course, he also used the Geneva Bible, which existed prior to the King James Version, and the Geneva Bible reads the Holy One. So, not exactly sure how they would like to deal with some of those issues, because I never specifically got any answers from any of my King James only friends on some of those questions. But so the Greek text here renders Ha-hasios, the Holy One. So why is it that the King James Version would read and shalt be, and the Greek that would say that is ha-esamenos, which would be the future tense form of the Greek word eimi, the verb of existence, and you will be, or shalt be, according to the King James Version. So I brought this up to my friend, and it's been brought up to many a King James onlyist, and I'm just not seeing any specific reason or reasoning that's being put forth that really asserts why it is that the King James Version should not be changed in light of this evidence. So again, we mentioned earlier that the King James Version is a translation of 7 printed edition Textus Receptuses, printed edition Greek New Testaments, which, as you can see here on the right-hand side of the screen, it's a printed edition Greek New Testament they collated an eclectic text, readings that they saw as the best readings amongst manuscripts, and they footnoted the rest as textual variants. So that's exactly what happened in the 16th century with Textus Receptuses that were used by the King James Version. So think about it this way. The King James Version is a translation of the King James Version translator's textual choices amongst 7 printed edition Greek New Testaments, each of them being an editor's textual choice amongst maybe a dozen Greek New Testament manuscripts. So they wrote an eclectic text. That's what the King James Version ultimately is. And in fact, in the 19th century, a guy named Scrivener came on the scene. He used the King James Version and looked at the 7 Textus Receptuses, picked the Greek readings that the King James Version authors picked, and wrote his Textus Receptus without any textual variants whatsoever in the footnotes, just the eclectic text. And that sort of became the standard Textus Receptus today, because those printed edition texts are not necessarily as readily available, and each one of them has different readings than the King James Version. And so now for a King James Version advocate or user, whoever it is, in order for them to specifically reference the Greek text, they have their own eclectic edition in what Scrivener wrote. And there's others. There's other Textus Receptuses that have been printed as well, but there were 7 primarily: 5 by Roman Catholic priest Desiderius Erasmus, 1 by Theodore Beza, Calvin's successor in Geneva, and a guy named Stephanus, which is his Latin name, his Latin designation. And so those are the Textus Receptuses. Well, 6 of those do not read ha esamenos, the one who is, or I'm sorry, the one who will be, which is what the King James Version translates, and only 1 of those reads the one who shalt be. And the one that reads the one who shalt be is Theodore Beza's Textus Receptus. Now, he was examining the manuscripts that he had available to him, and he didn't have the 5,700 manuscripts available to him that we do. None of those authors of a Textus Receptus have the amount of manuscript evidence that we have available to us. And the question that my King James only friend had asked is, why was that the case? God prevented, is his understanding. Again, he has to see into the secret counsel of the providence of God to make some of these assertions, to know that God purposed to reject manuscripts in the last 400 years of church history, and purposed to keep a small amount of manuscripts, almost all of them Byzantine, because Erasmus did have an Alexandrian manuscript at his disposal, and he did write to the Vatican Library to check Codex Vaticanus, an Alexandrian manuscript. So there were at least a small amount, though he did not rely heavily on Codex 1, I think is the Alexandrian manuscript designation that he had. He did not rely very heavily upon it, but he didn't have either a complete New Testament. There were 6 verses in Revelation that he had to translate from the Latin Vulgate into Greek in order to have the Greek version of that in his Textus Receptus. And again, he has numerous editions of it, at least 5 editions of his own Textus Receptus. And so to just simply say, yeah, those other manuscripts, the other ones that we have today, were not providentially used by God for a specific purpose of using better manuscripts, is to try to say that you have access to a full understanding of the secret counsel of God, which is just not the case. And if we say that, then why is it that, again, for the first 900 years we would have Alexandrian manuscripts, and now for the next however long we have 5,700 manuscripts, which is a combination of Caesarean, Western, Byzantine, and Alexandrian manuscripts. And again, those are just text types. Text types didn't even exist in the 16th century. Those were modern inventions to help collate and to help organize texts into group of texts to be easier to maintain and to be easier to handle. And so there's nothing magical about the text types. There's nothing inspired about the text types or anything like that. So again, if God rejected those for a specific purpose, why did he not reject them earlier? And why do we have them now if his purpose was to give us the best manuscripts for a limited period of time? I don't understand that. But at any rate, Theodore Beza is the one who departed from the typical reading, and he says that in the footnotes of his Textus Receptus. He even says the usual publication is Ha Hasios, the Holy One. And so he acknowledged and he admitted that he had no manuscript evidence whatsoever for Ha Esamenos, and yet he thought that it matched other verses like Revelation 1:4, the one who was and who is to come. And so he thought that was what John used. That's what the Apostle John had used, was that kind of a threefold expression to refer to Jesus, the one who was and who is coming. And so he thought there's no reason to just simply say the one who was and who is the Holy One, when that's not how John normally did it, which, of course, there's actually another place, Revelation 11:17, where there is another really significant textual variant, and the earliest manuscripts and the majority text, the majority of manuscripts, read the one who was and who is, and it stops. It doesn't go on to continue with Ha Erchamenos, meaning the one who is to come, or the coming one. But he cited Revelation 11:17, Revelation 4:8, Revelation 1:8, Revelation 1:4, recognizing that there are verses that exist that all specifically deal with that threefold phrase. So Beza logically reasoned that in a Revelation 16:5, it's supposed to be the same. But even then, he understood and even said in the footnote of his Textus Receptus that he changed it to Ha Esamenos, and he said, for why would he pass over it in this place? And so without doubting the genuine writing in this ancient manuscript, I faithfully restored in the good book, but was certainly there Ha Esamenos. So why not truthfully? He explains that he departed from Ha Erchamenos in the previous passages. He says, why not truthfully, with good reason, write Ha Erchamenos as before in 4 other places? Because the point is that the just Christ shall come away from there and bring them into being. That's it. So he doesn't change it to exactly match the previous verses that he logically reasoned were the reasons for his change, and he inserted a reading that would indicate that Jesus Christ will be. And so the idea and the argument from King James Onlyists is that that's how you express Jesus Christ, the one who was and who is and who will be, and that it has to relate to his eternality, and that you disrupt his eternality by calling him the Holy One. It makes absolutely no sense. You don't change the passages of Scripture to fit what you think that they should be. You change Scripture that you can demonstrate had been changed by scribes throughout the centuries, and that you have earlier manuscript evidence that proves that their change was wrong. Now, a lot of King James Onlyists will point out the fact that some of the manuscripts that we have, they've worn out over time. They've sort of become corrupted with time, and it's very difficult to read some of the readings in the manuscripts. But these readings on Revelation 16:5 are not difficult to read in the manuscripts. They're just simply not. And this is evidenced by the fact that you can look into the footnote, the bottom right-hand portion of the screen, and you can see the variants, you can see the readings that exist in numerous manuscripts. Now, it's actually not entirely true to say that there are only 4 pre-10th century manuscripts that support the reading Hasios. If we come down here and we highlight this portion right here, you'll notice what TXT means. You see it in the German there, and you see it precedes the list of witnesses supporting the text of this edition. So in other words, these are the main manuscripts that support the exact reading that is found in their eclectic text. And you can see that there is the Sahidic, which is the Coptic Greek translation, early on, 2nd century I believe, very, very close to the original writings. And the Sahidic translation understands Holy One. You also have, I believe, Andreas of Caesarea is 6th century, but you have the manuscripts of the commentary on Revelation by Andreas of Caesarea. Textual criticism looks at all available evidence at its disposal, and that would include a 6th century Greek commentary that has the Greek text cited in it, and the Greek text has Hasios. So there's a lot more than just the four manuscripts, the four earliest manuscripts that are Greek New Testament manuscripts that demonstrate the reading that disagrees with the King James Version. Now, King James Onlyists will also say, well, yeah, but those four manuscripts, they have corruption between them, and so it's hardly provable to see which ones have the accurate reading, which this is what drives me nuts, is King James Onlyists are quick to throw out all non-King James Version history. Just throw it away, all for the sake of specifically focusing and specifically emphasizing the King James Version. And so you give credit to guys like Bart Ehrman, who say that even the earliest copies are so far removed from the original text that it's impossible to have the original text. And now the King James Onlyists say, yeah, all of the first 900 years of church history needs to be thrown out. All of those manuscripts are not as accurate as the majority text manuscripts that make up 80% of the New Testament. And so you do justice to the critics. You give more fuel and more ammunition to the critics, and the critics would have a heyday if mainstream Christianity accepted and adopted the King James only argumentation and reasoning. It's absolutely ridiculous to have that kind of methodology and that kind of mentality. You throw away church history all for the sake and all for the purpose of the King James Version. It's unbelievable. Now, what is the textual variance amongst those four manuscripts? Well, as listed on the right-hand portion of the screen, the textual variants are a variant on kai, the Greek word and. Some of the manuscripts don't have that. You see has as a textual variant instead of ha, which, if you know anything about Greek, you know that has is a demonstrative pronoun and ha is a definite article, and yet the definite articles in Greek are really nothing more than demonstrative pronouns. So it doesn't make a huge change to have has instead of ha. It's not that big of a deal. And then when you have kai, it's the Greek word and. So you see here in Codex Alexandrinus, Codex C, the manuscript 1611 of the 10th century, manuscript 1854 of the 9th century, Codex C is 5th century, Codex Alexandrinus is 5th century. So you see that there's the lack of a definite article. I'm sorry, there's a lack of the Greek word kai there, the Greek word and, ha, ein, hasias. And there's a lack of a definite article right before hasias. These are hardly indicative of non-trustworthy manuscripts. Furthermore, hasias is present in all of these manuscripts. So when we come over here into the phrase that very closely resembles the phrase within the text, 11th century in manuscript 1006, 9th century, 10th century in manuscript 1841, 13th century in manuscript 2053, 13th century in manuscript 2062. And up here, the same concept of having hasias, a 10th century manuscript. You have here the Koine tradition proper in Revelation attesting to the same reading. P47, the 3rd century manuscripts that reads hasias, the earliest manuscript on this verse reading hasias. And then you see Codex Sinaiticus, Codex Aleph here is the designation, 4th century, P051, 10th century, and then, of course, Andreas of Caesarea, as well as the Sahidic manuscripts testify to the exact reading ha, ein, kai, ha, ein, ha, hasias, sorry, ha, on, kai, ha, ein, ha, hasias. So the point is that even the majority texts, even the Byzantine manuscripts, read hasias. The earliest texts read hasias. The later texts read hasias. The vast majority of overwhelming manuscript, all of the manuscript evidence prior to Theodore Beza, reads hasias. So what do you do in a situation where the vast majority, in fact even all of the manuscripts, Alexandrian and Byzantine, as well as Egyptian in the Sahidic, all of these manuscripts read hasias, and one Textus Receptus from the 16th century, on the basis of Beza's logical reasoning, what's known as a conjectural emendation, what he thinks the original should be without really any manuscript evidence to support it, one Textus Receptus reads ha esamenas, the one who shalt be, instead of ha hasias, the one who is holy. What do you do with that? Well, of course, the only thing that you can do is recognize that the manuscript evidence proves that the King James Version reading is wrong on Revelation 16:5. The King James Version reading is wrong on Revelation 16:5. Now, does that mean that you take your King James Version and you throw it, or you burn it, or you do ridiculous things like that? No, of course not. What it means is that you demonstrate a level of honesty when you come across that text, when you're dialoguing with somebody about Revelation, when you're preaching it from a King James Version. You demonstrate the honesty that a person needs to say, this is a conjectural emendation in Revelation 16:5. The reading that is preserved in the King James Version is clearly not the original text. Unless King James Onlyists would like to produce a manuscript that proves and indicates that there was an early reading or a Byzantine reading, a majority text reading. Just show me a manuscript that is a Greek manuscript of the New Testament that shows that the reading that Bezit picked was accurate. Now, this King James only friend of mine, and I've seen it presented by other King James onlyists, they've tried to argue for Beatus of Liébana, a Spanish theologian from the 8th century who wrote a commentary on the book of Revelation titled Commentaria in Apocalypsin. And in that, they argue for the Latin reading, which is not the Latin Vulgate reading, but a Latin reading in Beatus's text, in his commentary that he cited, and the Latin reading has the same reading that the King James Version has, just in Latin. Now, the Latin reading in that commentary is Futurus es Sanctus. So you hear the word futurus, or you see the word futurus, and it looks future, and indeed it can be a future text, a future tense, but as far as Latin is concerned, the term futurus, when used as a verb, does not mean future, but it's a verb of existence. Now, futurus, as far as I understand it from Latin, is a future active tense, but it's very peculiar to have a future tense associated with the Latin word es, which is present tense. So how would futurus es sanctum read? Sanctus read. Futurus meaning future, you will be, as present tense, are, you will be, are holy. That is absolutely terrible. So that's a grammatically incorrect statement. Now, of course, I don't hold a lot of stock within Google Translate, but if you go to Google Translate and you specifically type in Futurus es Sanctus, and you see the English rendering of that as you are to be holy, what do we do with that? So it seems very clear that even in Beatus of Liébana, and I'm not very well adversed in Latin, I'm relying upon the Dictionary of Latin Forms. It is a dictionary by William Whitaker, and it contains the words of the Latin texts and looks at them in their parsings and their conjugations. And futurus as an adjective means future or about to be, and futurus as a verb means to exist. And it's also in the form of a perfect passive. So it's not just a future tense form. It could also be used even as a past tense form like the perfect passive. And so futurus es sanctum, sanctus, could absolutely be referring to, as Google Translate even specifically holds, to just simply a statement, you are to be holy. But be that as it may, that's still a Latin translation, and certainly it's from the 8th century, according to kjvtoday.com, and there are versions in Greek, like Andreas of Caesarea, that specifically say the exact same thing, ha hasias. and all the earlier manuscripts. And so what do we do then in that specific case when we recognize that late readings disagree with early readings? Now, Beza never cited Beatus of Liébana. He didn't. There was another Latin commentary that was presented by my King James only friend from KJV Today, Haimo Halbert Studensis, a German bishop in the 9th century. And in this case, this one's even more irrelevant from the standpoint that his Latin text did not say, you are holy, or you will be holy, or thou wilt be. Which, of course, it's important to recognize that even in the Latin translation of Beatus, that Futuris es Sanctus is still referring to holy. So for the King James Version to drop out the word holy completely is completely untenable, even from King James Version supporters and the information that they're citing that says that Beza's conjectural emendation was justified. So it still is referring to the holiness of Jesus. Now, in Haimo's translation, it says absolutely nothing about a future tense. The future tense comes across in his comments on it. So there's no reason to then change the text because a 9th century German bishop specifically changed, or shouldn't say changed, but specifically commented on Revelation 16:5 that Jesus will be. It's absolutely untenable to make that kind of an assertion that because of a German bishop's comment, the King James Version's correct, and Beza was justified in his emendation. And then you go back to the reality that the manuscript evidence itself does not indicate the reading of the King James Version. Now, since the King James Version had been updated, changes have been made throughout the last 400 years, why wouldn't we continue? It's still in use. As far as I understand, there's still a publisher who has the ability to continue printing a King James Version, and so why not make the change? Well, I think part of the reason is that King James onlyists would be in such an uproar, and I think the King James onlyists are probably one of the best marketing schemes for the King James Version, even though it has been replaced by the New International Version, the NIV, as the best-selling Bible. But certainly the King James Version is still in use, and rightly so. It's a great translation. Again, the issue is that when you get to Revelation 16:5, you specifically be honest about the issue that's there. And on this verse, especially, the King James Version is not the most accurate. And then, given the fact that there's a problem in Revelation 16:5, a big problem, then people need to recognize that the use of the King James Version is perfectly fine. However, to say that it's the best, most accurate, and does not have any problems with it whatsoever, even though there's some that are quick to say, I'm not claiming it's infallible. I'm not claiming it's inerrant. I'm just claiming it's the best. Well, it's not infallible. It's not inerrant. And the reasons for that are like Revelation 16:5. And so why not just simply say, Revelation 16:5, either I don't know that it's original, or I know for a fact because of Beza's conjectural emendation that it's not original. That's just pure honesty. There's nothing else. There's no other reason to escape that specific reality. So that's one particular area. Now, of course, I've heard as the argumentation that to simply use the twofold form of the phrase ha'on kai ha'ain kai ha'erchamenas, as it would appear in Revelation 1:4 and in Revelation 1:8, to stop short is used nowhere else in the Bible, and so therefore, because it's nowhere else in the Bible, that way it has to remain in Beza's conjectural emendation as specifically the case. His reasoning and his argumentation is correct, it's sound, it's always a threefold phrase. Well, now we can go to Revelation 11:17, and we can specifically look at the textual variant that exists in Revelation 11:17 to demonstrate that there is another verse in Revelation that stops short of the phrase in saying ha'on kai ha'ain without saying kai ha'erchamenas, and that's Revelation 11:17. And so to take a quick look at that, Revelation 11:17, and again we'll highlight the phrase in question, ha'on kai ha'ain, And let's see. I need the highlighting pane, and I don't have that in this window. So I will highlight it right now, just with the cursor highlight, and hopefully it's not too difficult to follow along with this. But now remember, one of the specific arguments of King James Onlyism is that the Textus Receptus is best represented in the majority text. The majority text is the best way to do textual criticism. That's the only platform that you need, is to look at the majority text, the majority of the manuscripts. That's what many King James Onlyists are saying. That's what my friend who has argued with me is saying. And certainly that's an important thing to keep in mind, especially as we're going to look at a Revelation 11:17. And again, this is textual criticism. You're looking at the manuscript evidence, and you're beginning to ask the question, what did God originally say? Now, this is actually a fantastic verse, because I can show you a reading in the Nestle-Aland 28th edition Greek New Testament that I actually disagree with. So I'm not being a Alexandrian only kind of a guy, which is what I've been criticized as being, because I just simply recognize that we should take into consideration the earliest manuscripts. But here in Revelation 11:17, as I mentioned earlier, that looking at the Greek of the New Testament, looking at the Greek of the Old Testament, is a very important concept to do, because you see how the early translators of the Old Testament rendered names of God in Greek, and how the New Testament authors picked up on those naming conventions. And so for that reason, I actually have a disagreement with the Nestle-Aland text in Revelation 11:17, and it's regarding the phrase Kyrie hathos. Sorry, I got the entire thing highlighted there. Oopsie, that wasn't good. Pulled up the critical apparatus on the top as well. So Kyrie hathos, as is highlighted there. Now you'll notice these little brackets, and you highlight them, you hover over them, and it pulls up the critical apparatus. This is Logos that I'm using, by the way, in case anybody is looking for a Bible software program. And you can see that I actually have the New Testament manuscripts on the left-hand side. I have Septuagint manuscripts on the lower left-hand side. I also have Hebrew manuscripts on the lower left-hand side. And so you can see 832 Hebrew manuscripts. You can see 2,263 Septuagint manuscripts. And you can see that Logos has the count of 5,624 manuscripts. Some of these are hyperlinked that are allowing you to get information on the manuscript. And then you can also click on the hyperlink Institute for New Testament Textual Research, and you can actually look at images of the Greek manuscripts there. So this is a very, very useful, very beneficial tool for studying textual criticism for somebody like myself, who actually is not a textual critic. And you can begin to look at a lot of the various different things. Of course, Dan Wallace has a website as well, the Center for New Testament, the Center for the Study of New Testament Manuscripts is Dan Wallace's website. And so he's got a lot of digitized manuscripts there as well, in case you're interested in doing some textual criticism. Anyway, so Kyrie hathos. Well, you can see down here this little T-bar that is presented within the text. And if you click on it, it shows you exactly where that is in the critical apparatus, pulls out the critical apparatus, and it shows you that P47, that 3rd century manuscript of Revelation, has Revelation 11:17 in it, and it has the reading hathos. And if you come up here, you would see kurios actually in P47. And so Kyrie and Kyrios is a textual variant. I think that it would be Kyrios hathos, and the reason being is because every time that the Hebrew phrase Yahweh Elohim is translated in the Old Testament, in the Greek translation of the Old Testament known as the Septuagint, it is translated, Yahweh Elohim is translated as Kyrios hathos. And that comes across in many of the New Testament writers. Luke, for example, uses that in his translations or his citations of the Septuagint in his Gospel that translate Yahweh Elohim. And so that's why I think that the earliest manuscript specifically has Kyrios. I think that Kyrios hathos is probably the original reading. That seems like a Greek rendering of Yahweh Elohim, and that seems like that would also specifically make sense within this context here. So be that as it may, there's reason to doubt readings, but if you have Scrivener's Textus Receptus, you have none of this information below here. You have no clue that there's a textual variant there. I believe that's even Codex Sinaiticus that has kurios in it. So certainly that's an important understanding. Now when you come down here lower, you see this little bracket that says separates different variants referring to the same variation unit. And so there is a textual variant that exists in the phrase ha'on kai ha'ain, the one who is and the one who was. And then it would say kai ha'erchamenas, the way it does in Revelation 1:4 and 1:8, kai ha'erchamenas, and it says that in late manuscripts. A 10th century manuscript, an 11th century manuscript, it says that in a 9th, 10th century manuscript. It says that in the Clementine Vulgate. It says it in the Bohairic, which is also a Coptic. Both Sahidic and Bohairic are Coptic dialects, and there are New Testaments that were translated into both Coptic and Bohairic. I think Bohairic is actually earlier than Sahidic, but I can't remember from my brief studies in that. Tychonius from 390 AD, and Beatus of Liabana. Wow, looks like he's showing up again. And he's actually noted as a textual source for a specific reading. So what are the chances that back in Revelation 16:5 that Beatus of Liabana did not have a Latin reading that matched Beza's conjectural amendation? The New Testament critical scholars did not see that Latin textual variant as having any relationship to Beza's conjectural amendation. So, just something to point out there very specifically. Kai Erchamenas, and the one who is coming. Erchamenas is different from Esamenas, it's a different word. Not only is the tense different, Erchamenas is a present tense participle, Esamenas is a future tense, I believe, participle as well, and there are different words that are being used. Now, Erchamenas is from the lexical form erchamai. It's a deponent verb, and it is the verb of an action of coming. Now, I remember from Jonathan Pennington's vocabulary that erchamenas, erchamai, I should say, when used intransitively, can be a synonym of aimi, the verb of existence. So in other words, I could say erchamai, and I would be saying I am, just like if I said I me, I would be saying I am. I'd be saying the same thing. Now, I don't think participles in Greek have transitive versus intransitive properties. So it's not communicating the verb of existence, it's communicating the action of coming, which is why it's translated. Who is to come, or the one who is coming. Young's even specifically in Revelation 1:4, 1:8, 4:8, and 11:17 in the Textus Receptus would understand erchamenas as the one who is coming, or the coming one. And that's a present tense participle, and so Beza changed, not only did he change the tense to a future tense, he changed the word to a different word that is not being used synonymously. And that's also a textual variant here in Revelation 11:17. And it's important to note, again, you have this small number of manuscripts that show the reading of Ha Erchamenas. Now, of course, the Bohairic, as being a very, very early translation, very, very early Greek manuscript, Egyptian Greek manuscript, is using the reading there. But now we look over here at the text. The Textus marker, which indicates that the following list is a list of witnesses supporting the text of this edition. So the following is a witness to support why it is that the Nestle Aland Greek text chose to say ha'ain kai ha'on kai ha'ain. And that is because Codex Sinaiticus of the 4th century reads that way. Codex Alexandrinus of the 5th century reads that way. P046 reads that way of the 10th century. 1611 manuscript of the 10th century reads that way. 1854 of the 11th century reads that way. 2053 of the 13th century reads that way. 2329 of the 10th century reads that way. 2351 of the 10th century reads that way. And then here's a very fantastic marker that refers to the majority text platform, the text of the majority of Greek manuscripts. says ha'on kai ha'ain without continuing on to say kai ha erchamenas. Furthermore, the Vulgate and a part of Old Latin Witnesses reads the way that the Nestle-Aland text says it, which would disagree with the King James Version and agree with modern versions like the ESV and the NASB. And then all Syriac versions, not just some, but all Syriac versions, specifically refer to the reading that is differing from the King James Version and that is found in the Nestle-Aland's critical edition. So again, here's a fantastic example of a textual variant rejected by King James onlyists who hold to the majority text as being the better of all the manuscripts and reject the earliest manuscripts. But here is the majority of manuscripts, the majority text, agreeing with the Nestle-Aland text, and here's the Nestle-Aland text choosing a majority text reading. And many King James onlyists are quick to try to argue that the Nestle-Aland text, the United Bible Society's text, that those are what they call NU, the N standing for the Nestle-Aland, the U standing for the United Bible Society's text. They call it the NU. The NU is at odds with the Byzantine text, and it's at odds with the majority text, and that it's a purely Alexandrian text, and that it's purely based on Codex Sinaiticus and Codex Vaticanus. Which, if you listen to James White's debate with Jack Mormon, which is posted on YouTube on should we use the King James Version exclusively, you heard Jack Mormon say the same thing. That the Nestle-Aland text, the United Bible Society's text, is based really only on Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. My King James only friend sent me an article by a gentleman named Dennis Kanaga who posited the same argument. The NU text, the text of the modern versions, is based upon two major uncial manuscripts. Uncials referring to the capital letters that they used in the copying of their manuscripts. And they're based on Vaticanus and Sinaiticus. And yet here, the actual critical edition in the United Bible Societies is not very much different from the Nestle-Aland 28th edition Greek New Testament. Here, they're actually saying in Revelation 11:17 that the text, the textual witness that confirms the reading that they chose, is also a majority text reading. It's a Byzantine reading. And so the vast majority of manuscripts, really late manuscripts belonging to the era of the post-10th century, the 10th century, and post-10th century time frame, where the Byzantine text was a majority text type, and where the majority of the manuscripts are found, including earlier manuscripts like Alexandrinus and Sinaiticus. Where's Vaticanus here? Where's the Vaticanus reading in Revelation 11:17? And so in this particular instance, there are two early manuscripts that are being used to confirm the reading that they chose. They're rejecting earlier manuscript readings like Tychonius and the Baharic. And yet, the majority text, the Byzantine text, as well as Latin and as well as Syriac versions, are the readings that are specifically picked in Revelation 11:17. So, don't mean to belabor the point. I do mean to belabor the point, but not necessarily to continue dragging on there. But honestly, the statements that I have being made by our King James only friends are just completely confusing statements. We have to use the Byzantine text. We have to use the majority text type, the text platform, the majority text based on the majority of manuscripts from the 10th century onward. We have to use those. We have to use the Textus Receptus. And yet, when, quote-unquote, our text, the non-KJV onlyist text, those are all Alexandrian manuscripts, are all based on relatively few manuscripts, and they're based upon relatively few manuscripts that are Alexandrian from earlier time frames, and they're not represented in the majority text. What do you do then when you see an example like this in Revelation 11:17 that not only reads in the majority text and in the Alexandrian text, but it then has a reading that refutes an argument in favor of the King James Version, Revelation 16:5. So here it is. Here is a departure that the Apostle John has to leave from the normal expression, ha'on, kai ha'ain, kai ha erchamenas, to just simply say ha'on kai ha'ain. And so then when we go back into Revelation 16:5, and we recognize that it is a different expression, and John now includes the term hahasias because Jesus is the Holy One. That's a true statement. There's nothing heretical about that. There's nothing liberal about that. That's a fundamentally true statement to say ha'on kai ha'ain kai hahasias. There's nothing theologically wrong about that. It doesn't change the doctrine or the interpretation of the passage if it wasn't hahasias. And so it's not a liberal agenda to change the text, but that it's specifically a textual variant issue, and the majority text, the majority of manuscripts, Byzantine manuscripts also confirm the reading hahasias in Revelation 16:5. The argument that it can't be because John uses the threefold expression ha'on kai ha'ain kai ha'erchamenas, which in Revelation 11:17 we've just now proven that's not the case in that verse. John can depart from that. So the argumentation is thrown away on the fact that Beza's conjectural reasoning is false. The argument is also thrown away that we have to use the majority text manuscripts because the majority text confirms the reading that is different from the King James Version. So what do you do as a King James onlyist in those circumstances? Either you have to be dishonest and start to say that it doesn't matter, it's in the King James Version, therefore it's right. Go the way of Ruckman, who said that if you have a manuscript that disagrees with the King James Version, throw that manuscript away. There's no other way around these specific issues from a King James only perspective. There's just no other way around them. You either have to just simply be honest, and nobody is telling you to throw away your King James Version. But to just simply be honest with respect to the evidence that exists and understand that if you hold to a majority text view, you disagree with the King James Version's reading in Revelation 16:5 and in Revelation 11:17. If you believe the majority text has the original text in it, and that there's no need for any Alexandrian, Western, or Caesarean text types, then you reject the Textus Receptus that Beza wrote on Revelation 16:5 and on Revelation 11:17. You reject the King James Version's reading, and if you agree with the majority text, then you agree with the Nestle-Aland text. It's just simply the case. Well, I think my time is out, and I apologize for the mishap in the audio at the beginning portion. Again, this is stuff that is essentially new to me. I'm trying to figure this out as I go, and use live streaming software that I'm actually not entirely familiar with. I'm very surprised that I was able to get it working the way that I did. But again, I apologize about the audio issues. I'll see what I can do in terms of editing the portion where I'm talking in complete silence, a moment of silence, and see what I can do about getting that changed. But at any rate, we'll continue. I'm not exactly sure of what the time frame will be for these kinds of broadcasts. I think a lot of times it'll just have to vary based upon my schedule, but I'd like to keep it at the Tuesday time frame at 1:30. So keep that in mind. Mark your calendars for that. And otherwise, if you are not able to catch the live broadcast, these will be recorded, and I will share those on my Facebook page as well as my Twitter page in the future, and you can catch up on those later. Anyway, thank you so much for watching. Those of you that were watching, and those that will watch this later, I appreciate your support, and I hope this was encouraging to you, and I hope it was edifying and useful. And feel free to leave any comments. Feel free to email me any questions. We'd love to discuss those, and we'll keep going in the future. Some future broadcasts that I have planned is I'd like to go through some other arguments that I've had with my King James only friend related to the Septuagint. And I've made the statement that the New Testament cites from the Septuagint almost exclusively. There are times where it does not cite from the Septuagint, and there are times where it departs from the Hebrew text and the Septuagints that are known to us. So I'd like to go through some proof texts on why it is the New Testament cites from the Septuagint, and then also, as the name of this suggests, Nouthetic Apologetics and Counseling Ministries. I've got some upcoming plans to deal with some books within the counseling realm, like Gary Chapman's The Five Love Languages will be the first thing that I'd like to deal with, like to go through and review some of the issues that I have with that book, and hopefully that will also be a blessing and an encouragement to you. Apologize for going over in the total time frame, but again, with that audio issue at the beginning, certainly I needed to recover some things that I thought that I had covered in the first half hour or so that it was quiet. So thank you so much for watching, and God bless.